Why are two untapped islands the most fearsome threat in Magic? You sure this isn't just blue being overpowered? No, we fear it as a shadow, an echo, of a memory that has been lost to time only to resurface when you least expect it. Counterspell, the original menace, popularized the fear instilled by an opponent ending with two untapped blue mana. Were your spells safe? If so, how many? Be it a bluff or not, Counterspell and Counter Magic as a whole are very effective at what they do, so much so that it has warped the public's perception of an entire color and causes even the most seasoned veterans to hesitate. According to Magic Rule 701.5a, to counter a spell or ability means to cancel it, removing it from the stack. It doesn't resolve and none of its effects occur. A countered spell is put into its owner's graveyard. Countering is a removal effect that can only interact with spells as they are on the stack, limiting their potential targets, but in spite of this limitation, they thrive. The stack is the name of the game zone where spells and abilities are sent after they are played and where they wait to be resolved. This zone is the hunting grounds in which the counterspell player feeds. While fairly general, counterspells have an elegance to them in both theme and execution. No counterspell gets much deeper than counter target spell, but they have grown in complexity and reflect many different aspects of offensive and defensive magic, given the many magical spaces in which Magic's story takes place. Because counterspells function as removal spells for spells, they are beholden to the same rules we mentioned in a previous video, which you should totally go check out after this one. Those rules being, the lower the cost, the bigger the drawback. This is a flaw counterspells wear well, however, because as many will tell you, exiling 2 blue cards from your hand to force of will away a spell is well worth the cost. Though we must mention again, a removal spell is only as good as what it's removing, and that value begins to tank if you blow it on something like a ramp spell or the force itself gets countered. We mentioned counterspell being the standard, and that is reflected in cards like Mana Drain and Dovin's Veto, which both stamp out a spell for 2. Deprive and Familiar's Ruse clearly stand out as a point where Wizards of the Coast felt counter magic for 2 blue was a little too efficient to not have some downside. This leads into the Cancel family, which costs 2 blue and a colorless, and while decent, as well as very comparable to Murder, it will always be inferior to lower cost spells in formats that have access to both. We refer to this as the Brawl phenomenon. When something starts off kinda tame, then a new iteration is introduced and things get a little bit too wild, so corporate overcorrects in the next iteration, and it becomes just a bit too safe to be fun. This kind of thing happens a lot more than you would think. Then there are the 2 mana counterspells that only require 1 blue, which often have wacky downsides for such a mana-efficient removal spell. Disdainful Stroke and Negate can only target a specific type of spell, while Arcane Denial has a delayed trigger that lets you draw a card, and whoever owned the spell you countered with it to draw 2 cards at the beginning of the next upkeep. Then there's Tybalt's Trickery, which sure is Tybalt's Trickery. The spells that cost even less can sometimes be more detrimental, with Swan Song giving the spell's owner a 2/2 flying bird token, and an offer you can't refuse granting them 2 treasure tokens instead of their spell. Both also have restrictions on what type of spell they can target, and still, with all of these hangups and downsides, a lot of these we mentioned are still considered some of the best counterspells in Magic. We find the strangest by far to be the Spell Pierce family. This is because they are counterspells, but they let you pay to negate their effect. On one hand, in a situation where your opponent taps out to cast a spell, it functions identically to a counterspell. But outside of that scenario, your opponent will probably pay the mana and you'll waste your spell. Now, nothing in EDH is valueless, and decks exist themed around tapping everyone's mana and pulling out some big mana geyser finish, but maybe this is something we simply don't understand. We want you all to see these spells as the very risky gamble that they are, and you had better understand that they won't pay out big every game. This was just scratching the surface. There are still ability counters, high cost counters with huge upsides, and even creatures that function as counter magic on a stick play a huge role in the psychology of this game. But we have to call it for now. We've been Rude Kaiser, imbued with the indomitable spirit of humanity, hoping all of you remember to pay the extra.